I'm joined by Maximo Torero. He's the chief economist at the UN Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. I was thinking today the changes that we're seeing right now will come close to the crisis that many climate scientists were predicting 10 to 15 years from now. This is going to test global leaders, and it will be a foretaste of what is to come.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. I think that we need to be very careful how we analyze the current situation. Ukraine and Russia, of course, are responsible of 30% of the world exports of cereals. And as you correctly said, it is a significant share, which puts pressure on prices. And that's why we have been seeing prices exacerbate even more than what they were before. By February, for example, we knew that the price levels in nominal terms were as high as the prices in the 2011 food crisis. And this has exacerbated the situation more. But if we put this in real context and look exactly at the numbers of what is left to be exported from Ukraine and from Russia for this specific season, we are talking of 7 million metric tons of wheat and around 11 to 12 million metric tons of maize. This can be partially covered by other countries, as, for example, the case of India, which is exporting more wheat, 7 million metric tons, and maize can be covered from Argentina, Brazil, or the US. But a share will be still missing. The major problem and the major concern is the next harvest of next year. Because if the conflict and the war affects the infrastructure, the logistical part, the elevators, and doesn't allow people to do the harvest until the end of April or May, and doesn't allow the planting for next season, then we will be facing a serious situation.
Right, that's really important context, isn't it? I mean, we're looking at what's coming out of Ukraine. We should also talk about what's coming out of Russia. And Russia is a very important supplier of fertilizer to the African continent.
No, completely correct. So the food, the cereals normally supply to 50 countries, more or less. The most important ones or the most vulnerable ones are in North Africa, also Indonesia, Bangladesh. But fertilizers is central. So something which is structural and which was already in a very tight situation because the price of fertilizer is linked to the price of energy, and they were already going substantially up. Now it's going to be exacerbated even more if Russia is not able to export oil and export fertilizers. And there are already restrictions put in place for the export of fertilizers. And that clearly is a problem that will affect the next planting season. It's already affecting the planting season for next year. And that could have a significant problem because it's not only affecting two countries, it's affecting the whole big producers of commodities. And we will be expecting a reduction in yields. For example, there are some simulations already done that for Africa, they are expecting 30% less of supply of food because of the lack of fertilizers.
Yeah. I used to be, in a former life, a correspondent in Cairo, and in fact during the 2007-2008 global crisis. So I know firsthand what happens when you cut subsidies and when you put up the price of food, particularly the price of bread. I mean, do you there at FAO in Rome, do you talk about not just the hunger that will result, and that obviously is very, very serious, but the instability that we're going to see in countries that have just come through the Arab Spring?
Yeah, no, and the answer to that is straightforward. Egypt is inelastic to any price of food because they know the political consequences of an Arab Spring. So Egypt will be trying to do whatever they need to do to procure the maize and the wheat, especially, that they need. And that's what they are doing right now. They are trying to see if they can get contracts from Latin America, especially Argentina and Brazil, so that they can cover the gap. Now, for now, they have supplies, they have storage, like also Bangladesh, for example. But we're talking of 3, 4, 5 months that they can resist. But that's why it's so important that the conflict comes down in the next weeks, I hope. But if not, and if we get closer to as I said, to the next planting season, it could be pretty complex. And yes, it could create conflict, which is what we want to avoid. And we have lessons from the 2007-2008. The other problem, which is really worrisome, is export restrictions. And some countries are starting to do this, and this could exacerbate even more the situation. Yeah. We have heard that Argentina, for example, is thinking on doing this, and other countries. So that's what we need to avoid. Trade needs to flow. If not, the situation will get more critical.
Melinda Herring, let me just put this to you, because clearly there's going to be an awful amount of instability that comes from these food prices. Does it concern you that as the prices start to rise, countries like America might start to see grains, which they do export currently, as a security issue, as a strategic asset, which they might then start to hoard rather than export around the world?
Christian, I am not worried about grain yet. I'm more worried about the high fuel prices. I think Americans are behind Ukraine. More than 70% of Americans are paying attention and they care. And there's been huge levels of giving and organization in the U.S. But I think one of the big questions is how long will we be willing as Americans to pay these high petrol prices and then pay high grain prices as well? And I simply don't have the answer to that question.
Yeah. Mike Shields, we're talking about global food prices around the world and the instability and the insecurity that it might create. But of course, it has huge political ramifications there in the United States. The cost of living squeeze is going to be a terrible thing for Joe Biden to fight during the midterm season and all the way into the 2024 presidential election.
Yeah, and this was a huge problem before the Russian invasion. In fact, one of the things that's been a big debate in American politics in the last week is that the Biden administration is now trying to blame inflation and high energy prices on the Russian invasion, as if we've all forgotten that inflation was skyrocketing ahead of that. And in fact, right after they had a press conference and made the case that, Russia's causing high gas prices, the February inflation numbers came out from the government showing that it was the highest inflation in a number of years.
But wasn't that down to the global supply problems, which this is part?
But it predates that. In fact, if you actually look at it, inflation, literally the chart starts when Biden gets into office. And the thing that really precipitated it in America was massive government spending package for COVID. And that really sort of added rocket fuel to a situation that was already ripe for inflation to begin. And so those things were already happening. Gas prices were already, petrol prices were already skyrocketing in the United States before this happened. It's a very convenient excuse politically for Biden to now say, well, this is because of this calamity in Ukraine and world politics. The American people, if you look at the polling, aren't buying that because they'd already been living the reality of massive inflation before this started.
Just very quickly, single biggest issue then in the midterm season, rising prices?
I think so. I think the economy, rising prices, and just overall weakness, the weakness that that Biden seems to portray in terms of how he's handling everything going back to Afghanistan.
Okay. Maximo Torero, thank you very much indeed for your contributions from Rome. Thank you for your expertise. It's a very serious issue, and it's going to get worse, according to Antonio Gutierrez, who was speaking today in New York at the United Nations.